This is State and Revolution, an analysis of Lenin's book by the, Meaning of Marxism group, reading group. That's what we're going by currently. Group formerly known as Meaning of Marxism. But we were a reading group. We read this book from last fall up until the end of the year. And we wanted to just kind of do a presentation, share some of our thoughts on the book. And those of us who are presenting are myself, Tom. Can everyone mute? Somebody's a little scratchy.
That's Wu-Tang.
Yeah. So myself, I'm Tom. We've got Walt. Luke's going to present. Cody was a big part of putting this together, but won't be directly presenting. Might chime in. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Walt.
Cool. So I'm going to cover some stuff that isn't directly covered in text, but give some context to like the social and political situation that that Lenin was experiencing in the lead up to writing the text State and Revolution. The first thing I wanted to cover is like this is a time where we're seeing the collapse of a lot of monarchist systems, and what's really important about that is it's causing a fundamental reevaluation in how the working class views their relation to structures of power. And a quote I apparently didn't give a citation for, Lenin wrote, even in England, we see the powerful social groups support the privileged position of the bureaucracy and hinder the complete democratization of the institution. Why? Because it is in the interest of the proletariat alone to democratize it completely. The most progressive strata of the bourgeoisie defend certain prerogatives of the bureaucracy and are opposed to the election of all officials, opposed to the complete abolition of electoral qualifications, opposed to making officials directly responsible to the people, etc. Because these strata realize that the proletariat will take advantage of such complete democratization in order to use it against the bourgeoisie. So this quote is essentially discussing how the capitalist system will kind of try to defend itself. And it's kind of becoming this weird pseudo political schema where it pretends to look out for the workers. And the reason for that is because this is the first time in history that if you're not nobility, you have a voice. That's a new thing, and it's completely changing the way people are interacting with power structures. Another important thing that's altering the political dynamic is the outset of the First World War. You have this clash of these leftist movements that have built themselves on messages of international solidarity, who are dealing with the extreme nationalism that's inherent in any culture that predates the mass movements or mass easy movement of people. Most of these cultures are still very homogenous. If you're a German, you probably have never even heard what the Russian language sounds like. So as soon as the First World War broke out, we have all these Germans who are starting to develop this nationalist ideology and support the German war effort, and a lot of them were part of the SPD, which was, you know, one of the early German like leftist organizations. So this basically resulted in a wedge forming, where you like a schism happened, where you have like the further left separating from moderates who want to back this nationalist objective because it gets them more numbers, which they believe will get them more political sway. I kind of led into this a little bit, the divisions within the Social Democratic Party of Germany. This is the prime example of where nationalism really drove a wedge in, and it kind of caused this factionalism to rise up. Some of the famous names associated with it were Rosa Luxemburg, who formed your more left side of it, versus people like Bernstein, who was pushing a very moderate, I guess word would be a good word for it, movement that was really just trying to get as many members as possible, but was over-reliant on reformist tactics. Okay, did the slide move for everyone else? Who's controlling the slides? Thank you. Okay, so with the factionalism, we end up with a very unique person in the middle of it. There's a person that we are generally going to be referring to as a person who has a lot of problematic moderate views, but in the context of the schism in the SPD, he was still part of the left. So Karl Kautsky, Marxist philosopher, very important ideologue with the SPD, and also a big influence on Lenin early in his ideological, like theoretical development. The main thing we're going to be analyzing him in the scope of is how he believes that we can fix bourgeoisie society and gradually transform it to this socialist ideology. There's a quote that I thought really well surmises his views very well. Talking about the German proletariat, he states, it cannot win these battles. It cannot reach above mention the goals of democracy and abolition of militarism without itself attaining a dominant position in the state. And this alludes to his idea that it's not through destroying the state, but through seizing that state and using it as a good point, Jim. It's through seizing that state, using it as a tool of the working class was his idea. But ultimately, he just isn't accounting for all these mechanisms it's going to use to fight back. Can we jump to the next slide?
Yep.
So the last thing I'm going to be covering in this opening section to give context to this period of time was some key, I think, moments that shaped Lenin's ideology that directly translate into this text. The first one is Buchanan's article, Toward a Theory of the Imperial State. This article, which this is also a pretty long quote, I'm not going to read it out loud for everyone, but you guys can all kind of scope it out while I'm flapping my jaw at you. Basically, Buchanan was attacking this idea of any type of reformism leading to a transition of power, a revolutionary society. So Lenin at first saw this as an anarchist dribble, I think is what the text paraphrases him as saying, and saw it as a successively destructive thing, and was kind of going along with Kautsky, who believed that these violent actions were only a last resort if you couldn't seize any control within the state apparatus. But he also started witnessing a lot of the state fighting back against leftism, or what he would call Bolshevism at his time. And this starts radicalizing Lenin. It starts in Buchanan over the course of 1916. At the beginning of it, he criticizes Buchanan. By the end of 1916, he's firmly on Buchanan's side. So he begins his first draft of State and Revolution in late 16, which is kind of advancing these ideas that Buchanan put forward. A prototype to State and Revolution titled Marxism on the State. In 1917, the February Revolution occurs. The Tsar abdicates the throne because they're about to kill him, and a provisional government is erected. Immediately, Lenin criticizes it as being a tool of imperialism. In the unrest that follows this, Lenin returned to Petrograd and really developed the movement that would become the Bolsheviks that would one day succeed in their revolution. But this period was very violent. Lots of political violence was going on, and Lenin was forced to leave Russia multiple times in this period. It's in one of these periods of exile after a violent clash with government forces that Lenin has to get out of Dodge for his continued safety, and he begins writing State and Revolution, and that's where I'm going to hand it off to our next speaker.
All right. Thank you, Walt. So I'll be talking a little bit about the thesis of the book and some of the ideological disagreements. So in general, the thesis is Lenin wanted to reestablish what Marx really taught on the subject of the state and its relation to the revolution. So I'll talk about that first, then talk about Kautsky, Bernstein, and anarchists. So, Lenin really wanted to win over socialists that were familiar with Marx and Engels, but who had been misled by opportunists. He believed that Kautsky and the SPD leadership that Walt was talking about were distorting Marx and Engels to suit their own ends. In State and Revolution, he's talking about the problems of state power, that the working class can reorganize society if only it could take power into its own name. It has to do with who really holds state power, developing revolutionary theory. Also with World War I, Lenin wanted to confront the wrong-headed understanding of Marx and Engels' theory on the difference between capitalist and working class states. he said that it was in the interest of the proletariat alone to democratize the state completely. Just to expand a little bit on Bukharin, Bukharin said that the capitalist state cannot be reshaped for the purposes of the workers' revolution. It must be destroyed. Then the workers can construct a temporary organization of state power, a dictatorship of workers against capitalists. This is what we would call the dictatorship of the proletariat, which could be abolished in favor of the free development of socialist humanity. And that refers more to the withering away of the state that we'll get into later. Lenin initially rejected, as Walt said, Bukharin's arguments as semi-anarchist. The questions of relation of the state to the social revolution and vice versa was given very little attention by the leading theoreticians of the Second International, which was from around 1889 to 1914. And in general, they tried to evade those questions. The growth of opportunism led to the collapse of the Second International. Evasiveness benefited and fostered opportunism and resulted in the distortion of Marxism and complete vulgarization. So there's a lot of that language throughout State and Revolution about opportunists, about distortions of Marxism, and vulgarizations or Marxist vulgarists. I'm going to read a quote, which I got here on the next page. In regards to the opportunists, Lenin said, "Let them howl. This will earn them the praises of the bourgeoisie, and we shall go on with our work. In revising the program of our party, we must by all means take the advice of Engels and Marx into consideration to come nearer to the truth, to restore Marxism by ridding it of its distortions, to guide the struggle of the working class for its emancipation more correctly." I was going to talk a little bit about Kautsky. Walt kind of set it up, but as he said, one of the leading theoreticians of the SPD, he was the main representative of the distortion of Marxist theory during the Second International. He said that, as Walt mentioned, revolution might be needed, but this was dangerous and it should be avoided at all costs possible. The overarching goal was gaining more dominant influence in the parliament. Kautsky personally opposed the war, but he also opposed Luxemburg's left-wing party in the SPD. He said that we can leave the problem of the proletariat dictatorship to the future. In regards to the mass strike, he said it cannot be to destroy state power. We need to replace, and this is a paraphrase, we need to replace a hostile government with one willing to meet it halfway. The dictatorship of the proletariat can't lead to the destruction of state power. It can lead only to a certain shifting of the balances of forces within state power. The aim of our political struggle is to get state power by winning a majority in parliament. That was Kautsky who said that. Whether one agreed with Kautsky or not, Lenin's main issue with him was that Kautsky was developing ideas that were very different from Marx and Engels in regards to the state. And that's kind of a key point of State and Revolution, is that it's not just that he disagrees with Kautsky, but what Kautsky is saying is not what Marx and Engels said. Kautsky wrote in opposition to opportunists at times, like Bernstein, but gave concessions to opportunists. And he admits the possibility of seizing power without destroying the machine. A little bit about Bernstein. He was a collaborator and friends of Engels towards the end of his life. He was an early reformist and distorter of Marxist theory. He was more outright a reformist than Kautsky was. He said that the revolution was outmoded. He chose a more gradualist path to socialism that would eliminate any need for revolutionary upheavals, which he dismissed as outmoded. He accused Marxism of Blanquism, or as like a secret insurrectionary type of revolutionary practice. Bernstein distorts the meaning of Marx's phrase from the 1872 edition of the Communist Manifesto, the famous phrase, "The working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made machinery and wield it for its own purposes." Marx meant that the working class must smash the state smash the whole state machine. But according to Bernstein, it appeared as though Marx, in these words, warned the working class against excessive revolutionary zeal when seizing power. Kautsky ignored that Bernstein distorted Marx here. He said that we need to leave the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat to the future. From 1852 to 1891, Marx and Engels taught that the proletariat must smash the state machine. In 1899, Kautsky said, we cannot know how this will be done in the future. So very clearly, Marx and Engels were very clear on what they said, and Kautsky was kind of dancing around and changing things to kind of fit his own purposes. Both Bernstein and Kautsky had a things have changed perspective when referring to socialism. Last section about ideological disagreements, again, about reformist opportunists. Kautsky, Bernstein, Lassalle were social chauvinists, which meant that they were pro-war nationalist socialists. At the time of World War I is what was talking about. They accused anti-war international revolutionary socialists with being anarchists because that they preached the abolition of the state. They saw the road to socialism through the state, not abolishing it. On anarchists, Proudhon and Bakunin, some of the leading anarchists of Marx's time, agreed with Marx on the need to smash the state. They agreed on they disagreed with Marx, though, on what should replace the state. Proudhon and Bakunin argued for decentralized structures based on a loosely knit federalist organization. They believed that the dictatorship of the proletariat was just another authoritarian institution, no matter how democratic it was. Bakunin advocated for secret plots by a minority that would spark revolutions. He believed that the state could be abolished overnight. Lenin said that we should use the state as violence to suppress the bourgeoisie, to use the state against exploiters. I like this Engels quote in the book that he said, a revolution is the most authoritarian thing there is. And he was talking about the Paris Commune, which kind of creates a good segue. But lastly, I'll say that this book is primarily a polemic against Bernstein, Kautsky, and the anarchists. So some of the examples he uses, I will pass this over to Luke. Go ahead.
Hey, yeah, so I guess Marx and Engels, yeah, they really kind of developed their theories around the state through like a pretty serious analysis of different, I guess, revolutionary moments in France. But I really liked Lenin uses Engels' description of the state. The state is therefore by no means a power forced on society without, just as little as it is the reality of the ethical idea, the image and reality of reason, as Hegel maintains. Rather, it is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It's the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it is split into reconcilable antagonisms, which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, these classes with conflicting economic interests might not consume themselves in society in fruitless struggle, it became to have a power seemingly standing above society that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And that power is the state. And so, yeah, that basically is the state exists to protect the interest of the ruling class and protect capitalist society from swallowing itself. And Tom, do you mind clicking for me? And so that kind of, yeah, it's such a great definition by Engels. He's so awesome. I want to read more Engels. So yeah, I guess, and they drew these conclusions from first the 18th Revolution, like the 18th Brumaire written by Marx. There was it was a very corrupt and elite government, the July monarchy of Louis Philippe. And yeah, that there was a struggle between the liberal bourgeoisie, different factions of the bourgeoisie, the proletariat were all kind of aligned against this July monarchy, and it kind of reached a boiling point when a monarchy was suppressing any kind of political demonstrations and outlawing them in a lot of cases. So he, they revolted. Louis Philippe fled. A social republic was declared, and they set up a provisional government and started kind of, taking certain measures that were pretty radical, enacting universal suffrage, and establishing workshops to deal with all the unemployment. But as they were doing this, it was a really disorganized kind of effort, and there was just a lot of confusion as to what was going to happen. Different bourgeois factions kind of reorganized around the call for order. They kind of ended up gaining the provisional government had to tax the peasantry and the landed classes, and they were pissed about that too. So the bourgeoisie kind of ended up gaining the support of the middle class and the peasantry, and in the elections following the provisional government, they essentially kind of took control. They started rolling back kind of a lot of these radical changes, and the radicals kind of stormed the assembly and tried to take power, and they were brutally suppressed in the June Days Uprising. And that was kind of just like the end of the French Revolution for the proletariat. It kind of devolved into just a bunch of different factions, bourgeois factions, fighting over power. And so if you don't mind clicking, Tom, maybe one more click, get that guy in there. So yeah, I think Marx put it really well. Finally, in its struggle against the revolution. Oh, you go back. I have to read it off of there. In its struggle against the revolution, the parliamentary republic found itself compelled to strengthen, along with repressive measures, the resources and centralization of governmental power. All revolutions perfected this machine instead of smashing it. The parties that contended in turn for domination regarded the possession of this huge state edifice as the principal spoils of the victor. And yeah, I guess that was the primary failure. They kind of had sided with bourgeois factions and were trying to take control of the existing bourgeois state. And that devolved and it ended up in Napoleon seizing power, and you get the Second French Empire. And that is a super oversimplified explanation of it, but I think it's important to understand. And then the next slide, please, Tom. God, sorry, I wrote way too much. But yeah, the Paris Commune was kind of the shining example that Marx pointed to of a workers' government. The Second Empire of Napoleon had led, he was trying to, there was a conquest for, he was trying to dominate Europe and ended up in a war with Prussia that he lost, and he was captured. At this point, when he was captured, Paris was under siege, and he was captured. The empire fell, and the Republic was declared. Paris remained under siege. But as I think Engels puts it, but very soon the antagonism between the almost completely bourgeois government and the armed proletariat broke into open conflict. On October 31st, workers' battalions stormed the town hall and captured part of the membership of the government. And so, yeah, that happened. They remained under siege, and finally Paris capitulated. The mobile guard and regiments of the line that had been fighting Prussia were disarmed and imprisoned, but the National Guard, the armed proletariat, kept its weapons. Such was the respect which the Paris workers inspired in the army, before which all the armies of the empire had laid down their arms. I thought that was great. So Adolf Thiers, he's kind of leader of the Party of Order from the 1848 revolution, made an attempt to disarm the National Guard. They rebelled, and war was declared between Paris and Versailles. The Commune was later proclaimed. The Commune enacted radical measures, and they abolished the standing army, enacted universal suffrage, all the officials were paid workmen's wages. Yeah, I said there were a lot of words on this slide. Sorry. But yeah, it was, they enacted all these radical measures, and it was a true working class government where all the officials could be removed at any moment by through democracy, actual workers' democracy. But ultimately, Thiers and the bourgeoisie of Versailles were, I guess they were ensuring any kind of correspondence or propaganda from Paris was burned. They put down the free expression of opinion all over France, even forbidding the meeting of delegates from large towns. And after some negotiations, the leaders of Prussia released some of the French soldiers to the bourgeoisie, and they kind of ended up crushing the Commune. We'll get past that slide finally. Sorry. I tried to slim it down. And so, yeah, I guess this is where a lot of theories around the state and the worker state, and how that state is kind of distorted by Kautsky and the different opportunists, social democrats. But we're talking about not the bourgeois state, but the state is a special organization of force, an organization of violence for the suppression of some class. What class must the proletariat suppress? Naturally, only the exploiting class, i.e. the bourgeoisie. The working people need the state only to suppress the resistance of the exploiters, and only the proletariat can direct this suppression. So yeah, this is where this idea is developed. We saw in the 1848 revolution, the proletariat tried to collaborate with different bourgeois factions and use the ready-made state machinery, and that led to them being massacred. And with the Paris Commune, sadly, it was a similar result, but they had established like a true workers' state, and the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so this kind of gets us into these awesome quotes regarding it, which I don't know if people mind reading through. I don't need to read every single one. Read them? Okay, I'll read them, Jason. So by dictatorship, we have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class. I think that's a very important phrase, the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. The proletariat needs state power, a centralized organization of force, an organization of violence, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to lead the enormous mass of the population, the peasants, the petite bourgeoisie, and semi-proletarians in the work of organizing a socialist economy. And then this kind of brings us to the idea of the withering away of the state, which social democrats would expect to happen through like the election of socialists into government, which just kind of ignores the entire formulation of the idea of the proletarian state, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think Marx explicitly states it. Between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. And yeah, until this higher phase of communism arrives, The socialists demand the strictest control by society and by the state over the measure of labor and the measure of consumption. But this control must start with the expropriation of the capitalists, with the establishment of workers' control over the capitalists, and must be exercised not by a state of bureaucrats, but by a state of armed workers. Super important point to be made there. And then, once this revolution is achieved and these antagonisms and conflict kind of start to die down, the idea is that the proletarian state will no longer be needed and it'll dissipate. But that, I think Lenin also points out the importance of not being a utopian and recognizing that we have to unlearn all these different ways of thinking, this reified thought, if you will. And he says, we must not think that having overthrown capitalism, people will at once learn to work for society without any rules of law. Besides, the abolition of capitalism does not immediately create the economic prerequisites for such a change. And I think that can be kind of directed at anarchists as well. Kind of that romantic idea that we're just going to figure it all out after we smash the capitalist state. No, we're all kind of fucked up from capitalism. And we have to continue kind of developing ourselves and unlearning all these things. I guess those are some of the main points that Lenin made, kind of regarding Kautsky and all those and Bern and all those dudes. I'm not sure. I think that was kind of the end of my little section. Did I just call that little? Cool.
Tiny. Thanks, Luke. I also want to mention too is in this reading group, Michael was also a part of it as well. So I know, like in the discussion, we can each kind of throw in some thoughts, as well as Cody, as I mentioned. I threw in some. It's just kind of an opportunity for each of us to throw in our general remarks about the book. One main point is that the book was unfinished. Chapter 7 is literally like one paragraph, and then it says, and then the manuscript breaks off. And it was supposed to be a chapter on the experience of the Russian Revolution. So it was an unfinished book. Lenin kind of blurs his ideas. This is a criticism that Todd Cretion, if that's how he says his name, he mentions in the beginning is kind of like a criticism, is that Lenin tends to blur his ideas with Engels and Lenin, and he doesn't really differentiate when it's him sharing his ideas, when it's Marx and Engels. One strength is he really does, Lenin references every single writing that Engels and Lenin wrote on the subject of the state at the time. So he got like his hands on everything that he could and uses a lot of references. Yeah, sorry, the renegade Todd Cretion, got his full title. Luke, do you want to jump in, say anything? Or Walt, about the use of repetition?
Yeah, I think I think these things that Kautsky and Bernstein were, these ideas that they were, these distortions that we're making were putting revolutionaries. I mean, I guess not. I guess the real radical revolutionaries, it was something that they had to directly confront and do so from every angle. And I think that's kind of what Lenin did, is kind of approach it from like, okay, you've distorted it. I mean, he did, like you said, he went through everything that Marx and Lenin wrote about the state, and said, no, like, you guys are very clearly distorting this. And especially, I think, where you say, like, where Kautsky says, like, in the early 1900s, like, we don't know what we're going to do to move forward or whatever. It's just like, yes, that dude was a Marxist. That dude read a lot of Marx and was actually a pretty brilliant Marxist. But he definitely distorted some shit. And there was a very serious need to deal with that. And I think he does a good job. So does Rosa Luxemburg too.
Yeah. Walt, do you have anything you want to add here?
I mean, I like the repetition. If there's one thing at the end of this text, is that in Germany and Russia, the social chauvinists be creeping. His like consistent usage of these like almost comedic insults, like just throwing fire at all the reformists. It does show the the like political urgency in his times, like how essential it was that he puts like a stop to this poisoning of the well of Marxism. It gives a lot of cool historical context. I mean, of course, reading this text very much furthered my theoretical understanding. So yeah, it's badass.
I'll point out too that there are a lot of like parallels and some contrast to our reading group, or many of us who were in this State and Revolution reading group are reading Rosa Luxemburg, a book on her, and currently we're in the middle of the essay Reformer Revolution. So similarly, Reformer Revolution is a polemic. In this case, not Kautsky, it's on Bernstein and a lot of his ideas. So I like that there are some parallels. It's written within the same general kind of time. But that's kind of something we're noticing as we are reading that. Lastly, I'll say the experience of reading this as a group, as Walt pointed out, has been kind of furthered our understanding and collaborating. So it's been very helpful for reading some of these old texts. I will say that the Luxembourg text is a lot more, a little bit tougher to read than the Lenin one. But with that, we have just a couple of questions for discussion. How does this connect to today? What can we learn from some of what Lenin wrote about in State and Revolution? And with that, we are done with our presentation, finally.